Hi. Welcome to the Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law weekly seminar series. We are excited to have with us today No Lulu, who is Associate Professor of Political Science and Associate Director of Lab Ops at Vanderbilt University. He studies comparative political behavior, partisanship and political parties, class and inequality, representation, and legacies of violence. He's the author of Party Brands in Crisis and co-editor of Campaigns and Voters in Developing Democracies. Today, he'll be speaking about new research on groups in conflict and legacies of violence. Thank you, No.
Thank you. Thanks everybody for being here. I know it's the end of the term, the crunch at the end of the year, so I appreciate it. So this is.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, you should be able to.
There we go. So this is a joint project with Leo Faisakin, who's at NYU Abu Dhabi. And this is what I'm going to present is sort of a kind of overview of our book project and a couple of the cases within that, as sort of a subset of the theory. So we're interested in kind of these questions of groups in conflict, how groups, particularly in our case, it's going to be ethnic groups, interact in conflict settings, and then the legacies that the violence between groups has. So here's sort of what I think we know about this topic. So we know that group animosities, intergroup animosities persist for decades. We've done some work on this already, and others as well. We know that the grievances that arise from those animosities are tied to group identity. So people who sort of feel more strongly identified with the group also feel sort of stronger grievances. And we know that the experiences of violence heighten group identity and out-group animosity for the individuals who sort of experience that violence. And then in this, we're going to sort of separate what happens sort of in the context of violence and what happens after, but obviously there's also sort of a large literature on political actors, political entrepreneurs who activate or sort of mobilize groups on the basis of these kind of heightened grievances and animosities. So I think we know that all of those things happen when people are exposed to violence, and sort of one way to think about what we're trying to do with this book project is to ask, you know, what about the negative cases? So why, oh, this is all. So what about cases where violence and conflict don't produce those kinds of legacies, right? So the things that get published are the kind of arguments about why legacies, why things persist, why exposure to violence has sort of long-term effects. What doesn't get published or doesn't get studied are cases where those things don't obtain, where we don't see sort of persistence or legacies. But those cases do exist, and we could probably think about some intergroup conflict settings that haven't led to sort of persistent legacies of animosity. So what we want to do with this book project is really sort of ask why, in some cases, do we see these legacies, and in other cases, do we not? Okay, and so our argument, in a nutshell, is that it's going to be the context matters. So not all forms of violence are the same, and we're going to try to unpack sort of along two dimensions, different types of violence and how they might generate legacies or not. How violence is experienced really varies by context, and this is something I'll come back to when I talk about the particular cases that I'll mention today, but the difference between sort of how we think about conflicts and sort of grand narratives of conflicts from the outside and how they're experienced at the individual level might be very different. And ultimately our contention is that that context shapes the effects of violence, both for the people who are exposed to that violence and for us, their descendants. This is going to be where we look at legacies. Okay, so the argument sort of has, it's a sort of 2 by 2. It's going to have sort of 2 main factors that we think matter. One is the ability to attribute responsibility for the violence, right? So who is perpetrating the violence? And we're going to see we're going to sort of expect the biggest effects and the biggest sort of likelihood of legacies to emerge when an ethnic outgroup is clearly responsible for the violence that people are exposed to. The other thing that we think matters is ethnic targeting. Right, so why am I being victimized or exposed to violence? Right? And if it's the case that what people understand as the reason that they're being targeted is their membership in an ethnic group, then that's going to have sort of the kinds of legacies that we're interested in. So we're going to argue both of these things to see legacies sort of persist. So how do we know when there might be sort of clearer or less clear, more ambiguous responsibility? We can sort of divide these into cases, although in some sense, you really have to know a lot about some of these cases to have a sense of how people are experiencing them. But for instance, cases of state repression might be cases where attribution of responsibility is relatively clear. The state actors are engaging in violence, and the perpetrator there is quite straightforward. In a context of civil war, this might actually be much more ambiguous. It may or may not be, right? So we could think of sort of civil war cases where it's quite straightforward who's perpetrating violence. In others, in particular Guatemala, that I'll talk about, it's actually much more ambiguous, especially for civilians who are sort of caught between warring factions. Another case of sort of clear responsibility is going to be when the actor is actually the sort of actor involved in kind of mobilizing violence is actually the one engaging in violence on the ground versus having proxy perpetrators. So again, we'll see this in the case of Guatemala. You can also think of different types of violence as having sort of clearer or more ambiguous sort of responsibility attribution, direct violence, where we think about sort of small arms, face-to-face, kind of more intimate, to use sort of Jason Wittenberg's terminology, forms of violence versus more indirect forms of violence, like aerial bombardment or large-scale arms, less targeted, obviously less face-to-face. Again, I would say direct violence, it's very clear who's perpetrating. Indirect sometimes can be very clear and other times less clear. So that's why I say sort of some.
This is just a clarification question, but in terms of who, is it the affected group where it's clear versus ambiguous, or is it sort of a more objective, clear versus ambiguous?
In terms of
who's considering where the responsibility lies? Like, is it,
the victims. Right.
So in terms of what the victims see.
Right. Whether it's clear to the victims or ambiguous for the victims. Yeah. And again, so that's an important distinction because it might be very clear to us or to sort of an outside observer who's kind of engaging in the violence, but actually,
or vice versa,
yeah, or the other way, right. All right, so that's kind of kind of macro picture. And in terms of the kinds of legacies, and I'm not going to say too much about this, but in terms of the kinds of legacies that we're interested in, it's sort of micro level, individual level legacies. And we draw a lot on sort of the psychology literature on trauma. But basically what we have in mind is sort of this kind of schematic where people are victimized or sort of exposed to violence in some sort of way. And the legacy is that this is going to have an effect on the identities and attitudes and behaviors of their descendants. And you'll see this in the cases. This might be children and might be grandchildren, depending on the timing of the, when the violence takes place. And kind of the story that we want to tell, although we can't exactly trace the entire process, but we have, I think, some suggestive evidence of the process, is that victimization shapes identities. In particular, ethnic violence shapes ethnic identities. Again, that's sort of consistent with the trauma literature. Identities are socialized across generations, right? Parents we teach our children to sort of hold similar identities to ours, and then those identities influence sort of attitudes and behaviors. So that's kind of the individual level or the family level story. But yeah, here I'm not going to sort of dwell too much on that. So the research design, we have 4 kind of cases you can think of as sort of case studies. In each one of them, we kind of started with kind of more qualitative, semi-structured interviews on the ground, and then we moved from that to developing kind of a survey instrument with cognitive interviews. And then we fielded a multi-generational survey. So these are surveys of families, and then we interview both people who lived through the period of violence and their descendants who were adult descendants who were born after the period of violence. And that's an important sort of feature. So again, at sort of the macro level, we're kind of leveraging 2 things, sort of cross-case variation in the variables that we care about, attribution of responsibility and ethnic targeting. But we also have within case variation where different types of violence are going to be sort of more or less attributable, right? Sort of more direct or indirect, that kind of thing. Right, so these are the 4 cases. We look at the Crimean Tatars in Ukraine, Crimea, what used to be Ukraine, and is now Russia. And this was violence that took place between 1944 and 45, and I'll talk about that case. The Isla Maya during the Guatemalan Civil War, or this period in the Guatemalan Civil War that's referred to as the violence. And then 2 cases in Cambodia that I won't talk about, but I'm happy to answer questions about. One is a Muslim minority population, the Cham, and the other is a survey of the ethnic majority population in the northwest of Cambodia. And obviously both of those are violence that took place during the Khmer Rouge regime between 75 and 79. So the 2, 3, and 4 here are parents and then their adult children who were born after. Obviously that's as far as we can go with adults. And the Crimean case, we have 3 generations. Okay, so there's a few reasons for why these cases, they give us variation. I'll show you on the variables that we're interested in. They also have some kind of practical advantages, and as I was saying earlier, there's no shortage, unfortunately, of cases of exposure to violence around the world. But we pick these cases in part because they allow us to actually sort of do the work that we want to do. So these are populations that are mostly compactly settled and low immigration rates, right? So we can interview parents and their children. We don't have to worry too much about children or grandchildren who have moved out of the country and are sort of more difficult to find. Really important for us is that the descendants have no interactions with the regime or the perpetrator of the violence, and that for a variety of reasons, and this kind of varies by case, the targeting of the violence at the individual level, we think we can sort of make a plausible case for exogeneity. So here's how the kind of different cases map onto the 2x2. So yeah, I don't know, I won't say too much about that. And I'm going to focus on the Crimean Tatar case and the Guatemala cases. So we'll sort of compare the torture and family deaths comparison there, and we'll sort of leave the non-ethnic cases in Cambodia aside. But again, I'm happy to say more about them. Okay, so let me say a little bit about these two cases in Crimea and Guatemala. So Crimean Tatars, this is a Sunni Muslim ethnic minority in Crimea. They're today about 300,000 people. In 1944, the Soviet Union retakes Crimea from Nazi Germany. And within a couple of weeks of retaking Crimea, Stalin secretly orders that the Crimean Tatars be rounded up and deported. Now, obviously, for those of you who know anything about Stalinist Soviet Union, there was a lot of moving of ethnic groups over the course of the 1930s and 40s, and so this was something that the Soviet Union had become very adept at doing. There's sort of various theories about why this was done, partly having to do with sort of Stalin thinking that Crimean Tatars were sort of either had collaborated with the Nazis or that because of sort of ethnic ties to Turkey were sort of collaborating with the, were sort of, anti-Soviet in some way. At any rate, over the course of 2 days with basically no warning, the Red Army sort of fans out across Crimea and tells people to, gather their belongings in the next 5 to 10 minutes and get on trucks. And then the trucks take them to the cities where they board sort of cattle car trains, similar to the kinds of things you often see in sort of World War II sort of Holocaust related. They are then deported to what is today Uzbekistan in Central Asia. This is a 4-week roughly train journey, during the summer. So conditions are not very good. Lots of people die either sort of during the train journey or right afterwards when they arrive, and they're sort of placed into sort of barracks, something similar to sort of concentration camps. Eventually, they are allowed to sort of, build their own houses and have farms and do things like that. You can sort of think about it more as kind of closed reservations, sort of larger areas where they're allowed to live, but they're not allowed to leave. And actually, they're not allowed to leave without permission from the Soviet regime until 1989. What's really remarkable about this case is that even Red Army officers who were Crimean Tatar, who were serving on the front at the time, are sent back to Crimea to get on the trains over the course of those 2 days. So there's really no discrimination. Anybody who is Crimean Tatar is sort of rounded up. And the official Soviet record is 15% died in this kind of early period during the deportation and right after. The kind of Crimean Tatar nationalist movement estimate is 45%, so somewhere in between there. Finally, a sort of important point is in 1989, Gorbachev allows them to return to Crimea, and just about the entire population returns to Crimea. And then we're going to survey them in 2014. The other case is the case of the Isla Maya in Guatemala during the Guatemalan Civil War. This is an indigenous Mayan minority, roughly 250,000 people today. The Guatemalan Civil War begins with sort of a leftist insurgency, university professors who sort of go out into the jungles to recruit peasants for a kind of leftist rebellion. In the mid-1970s, this insurgency moves into what's referred to as the Isla Triangle, the sort of 3 municipalities where the Isla Maya live up in the highlands in Guatemala. Partly, this is one of the poorest populations, poorest peasant populations in the country, so this seemed like a good recruiting ground for a leftist insurgency. Partly also, there's kind of a stereotype of the Isla Maya because of various kind of rebellions against the Spanish colonialism. They are sort of stereotyped as a rebellious population. So the sort of guerrilla leaders thought this would be a good place to recruit people. So they recruit, they also coerce, and sort of position themselves in the mountains outside of Isla villages in the mid-1970s. By 1981, the army, particularly being led by Efraín Ríos Montt, who's later convicted of genocide, sort of engages in a scorched earth campaign to get rid of the guerrillas in this region by getting rid of the entire population. So it's indiscriminate violence, treating all Isla people as sort of supporters of the guerrillas. And he has this famous line about, in order to kill the fish, you get rid of the water. So roughly 30% of the population dies during this period, 1981 to 1982. And this is the period that the Isla refer to as the violence. What's sort of a little bit different in the Isla case than in the Crimean case is that one of the things that the army does, so of course we have 2 different sides in this civil conflict, neither of which is Isla, right? Though they're both sort of recruiting and coercing members of this group. But the army in particular recruits and coerces Isla members of the Isla community to be what they call civil patrols. And actually a lot of the violence and a lot of the indiscriminate violence is perpetrated by the civil patrols. So, so in those cases, massacres and sort of indiscriminate violence is being done by members of their own ethnic group. So that's a sort of important distinction. A lot of the death that takes place is starvation. People, because of the violence, leaving their villages and moving up into the mountains, and then having to try to survive. A lot of children die as a result of that. And this kind of, as I said, and this is David Stoll, an anthropologist, has a book about this conflict. It's quite controversial in anthropology, but that he calls Between Two Armies, where he sort of tries to, despite the sort of grand narrative that the army engages in a lot of the indiscriminate violence, and in fact, truth and reconciliation efforts have sort of documented that a lot of the killing was done by the army side and not by the guerrilla side. For the members of this community, the way that they describe the violence is very much feeling like they're in the crossfire between two armies, right? And less so, less one-sided than the kind of narrative that we tell about the conflict. So here we're going to look at family deaths, having lost members of your family versus family members having been tortured. And the reason is that torture is a form of direct violence. It was not outsourced to the civil patrols. It was done by army officers. So you knew who was doing it. The army officers are ethnically what we would call white, in Guatemala are called Latinos. And so you have a sort of out-group, in-group dynamic that you don't have in the cases of deaths, where a lot of deaths are either sort of indirect or perpetrated by civil patrols. Okay, so we did surveys, as I said, in both of these. The sample is representative of families with a living victim. So that's important to keep in mind. We did a survey in Crimea in 2014, has 3 generations, and we sort of sampled starting with the grandparents, the older, some in their more or less in their 80s on average. Then we interviewed, randomly selected 2 of their children, and then randomly selected up to 2 of their children's children. At that point, we get into sort of people who aren't adults, and so we didn't get quite 4 of each, right? So we don't get quite to 1,200. All of the surveys are done in the local language. They're fielded by co-ethnic enumerators. That was really important to us. And I'm happy to say more about all of the field work. The Ishiel survey we did in 2019, so 2 generations. Here we actually went in both directions. We sort of sampled people who lived through the violence and then their children, but also the other way around. We sampled people who were born after the violence and then interviewed their parents. Then we used co-ethnic enumerators and had the interviews done in both languages. Actually, there's 3 different dialects of Ishiel, and it's an oral language, so this was a real challenge. Okay, so the important variable for us, it'll be both a dependent variable and an independent variable, is the exposure to violence. Here, I'm just gonna focus on number of family members who died and number of family members who were tortured in the Guatemala case. To begin with, here's just to give you kind of a sense of the exogeneity that we try to argue. For the Crimean Tatar case, right, there's kind of infectious diseases and starvation. It's not random, but we don't think there's any reason to think that people who were more likely to die of infectious diseases or starvation, were sort of more likely to have certain political identities. Similarly, in the Ishiel case, we think there's lots of reasons to think that all of this was done quite indiscriminately. But with torture, we might, so we account for control for a couple of things. But in the surveys, we asked people about sort of pre-conflict aspects of sort of their families, family history, political positions, identities, and things like that. And so here I'm just showing you that that's mostly uncorrelated with the actual victimization that they report, except again, in a couple of things that correlate sort of weakly, but statistically significantly with torture. So we'll control for those things. And So this is kind of our, biggest takeaway. We look at identity in terms of attachment to the ethnic group, the in-group, and also sort of lack of trust in the out-group. We ask people whether they identify as victims, and that's kind of an important part of our story about victim identity being tied into ethnic identity. And threat perception, right? The perception of threat from the out-group. So those are all things that come out of like trauma literature. And you'll see that for the descendants of people who experienced more violence, who lost more family members, there are sort of positive effects in the Crimean case and in the Ishiel torture case, but not in the Ishiel, right? So here's the sort of variation with the sort of negative cases that we don't always see, right? And so our argument is that all of these are sort of ethnic targeting, and I think it's clear to everybody who experienced this that they experienced it because they were members of an ethnic group. But we think the sort of difference here with family deaths in the Ishiel case is that who the perpetrator is not all that straightforward. And that comes out in our qualitative interviews as well. As I said, we can also look at sort of attitudes and behaviors, and we do that. We think all of this is really sort of secondary to the transmission of identities, but you see that in the cases where identities are transmitted, we also see that people whose ancestors suffered more, were victimized more, are more likely to sort of hold sort of attitudes that are sort of support the politics of the group, less trusting of the regime. In the Crimean case, we asked whether they supported annexation, right? Again, this survey was done right after Russia annexed Crimea. There was a referendum held right after Russia annexed Crimea, a referendum on whether it was okay that Russia annexed. And obviously the Crimean Tatars were not supportive of that. And then the local election was held where, of course, United Russia, Putin's party, won. And again, they were less likely to vote for United Russia. The same in the Ishiel torture case. We see sort of more support for Ishiel political organizations. They have kind of parallel political leadership in Ishiel villages. There's the kind of elected mayor and then the indigenous mayor. They celebrate holidays that are sort of consistent with the group. The Ishiel have a day they refer to as Genocide Day. Less trusting in sort of the political institutions of the country, less satisfied with public services and things like that, right? Again, the regime here is associated with the outgroup.
Sorry, so the variation here is the number of people in your family who are affected? Okay.
Yeah, so it's, I mean, none of these people are non-victims, right? And everybody is, right? So, I mean, the Crimean Tatars, everybody is deported, right? It's just sort of variation above a baseline. Okay. Yeah. And then finally, we look at behaviors, and Carlos and I were just talking about participation earlier, right? So there's, of course, the literature on sort of the effects of violence on participation. I think one of the things it misses is that there's reasons under certain circumstances you might participate more, and under others you might less. I think it's not surprising that the Crimean Tatars, whose sort of political leaders mobilized around boycotting the Russian elections after Russia invaded, that people who sort of identified more with the group, whose ancestors were victimized more, are going to be less likely to participate in those elections. Like, they're more likely to listen to the leaders. Whereas in the Ishiel case, they're more likely to turn out, right, and more likely to sort of support kind of local politicians. Right, and then, we have some questions about other forms of participation and willingness to participate because we were already in the Crimean case in a sort of authoritarian context. All right, so I hope what I've sort of tried to show you that group animosities do sometimes persist because of the effects of violence. And again, that's not necessarily new, but that ambiguity, ambiguous attribution of responsibility sort of attenuates those effects. And in cases where this is very ambiguous, we're not going to see those kinds of persistent effects. As I said, also cases of non-ethnic targeting, we would expect not to see that, but I haven't shown you that. And again, another way to sort of say that is that the context in which the violence happens matters. What are the sort of broader implications beyond that? So not all violence produces legacies. And, I think that's something that this boom in literature on historical legacies generally, and more specifically historical legacies of violence, has kind of focused so much on making the case that legacies exist, that it hasn't really gotten to the point where we're looking at negative cases. Of course, we're focusing here on conflict context, and there's lots of other violence out there that might matter. We're also kind of setting aside a lot of the post-conflict context. I can say more about that, but yeah, and there's sort of some work on what that might look like. Rosenas and Zhukov have sort of a nice paper on sort of different, how legacies of violence might differ across different kind of post-conflict contexts. How people experience violence may differ from how it looks to us. And I think the Guatemalan case is sort of really emblematic of this. If you look at sort of the statistics and the numbers, you would say clearly the army is engaging in a lot of violence and the Ixil should be upset with the sort of ethnic outgroup. But that's not really at all consistent with how people experienced it and how people talk about it. Yeah, and as I said, this kind of selection bias for positive cases means that we're missing a lot of what's going on. I'll leave it there. Look forward to your
I'll get you on the list. Eric?
I really enjoyed the presentation. Thank you for it. And I want to ask you something that's sort of outside the box of your presentation. Your insight on not all violence produces legacies, I think is important, having worked across many conflict countries and observed the post-conflict industry around truth and reconciliation. The usual toolkit for international actors is to assume that a truth and reconciliation process is necessary irrespective of the conflict. And I'd like you to ruminate on that a bit.
Yeah, it's not totally, do you want to take a bunch or do you want me to respond?
You can do one by one. I think.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
So it's not totally out of the box. So we did ask questions about, in the cases where there is, so Guatemala and Cambodia have both had something of a truth and reconciliation process. They're very, very different and not entirely institutionalized, but and we did ask questions about those. I think a lot of the literature and the motivation for those kinds of things is very lax empirics. It's mostly kind of, I think the theory draws on kind of psychology and testimony and the idea that like therapy, sort of talking about things, sort of, improves one's psyche after trauma. And then you sort of extrapolate from the individual to a society and you say, if we, sort of talk about these things, but there's really no, or very little, I I think, empirical evidence that that actually happens. So in our cases, I think there's sort of two things I can say from our data. One is people have very little knowledge of the truth and reconciliation processes in both Guatemala and Cambodia. They basically, except for we did actually interview a couple of people who testified. And it's remarkable how much clearer and more articulate they are in talking about their experiences, right? So they get kind of coached and all of these things. With the exception of them, very few people knew anything about the proceedings that were sort of going on, or that any of these things had happened. So, if that's the case, then it's hard to imagine that these things have kind of a big impact at the individual level. The other is that one of the things that we find, and we're sort of looking at family transmission, which is really hard to sort of pin down empirically, but one of the things we look at is whether or not you talked about the events, the violence with your family members. And the people whose parents talked about it more, or grandparents, are stronger on all of these things. So it has the opposite effect, right? So if you talk about your victimization, then I become more distrusting of the out-group and more sort of in-group attached, right? Which is the opposite of what the sort of theoretically the truth and reconciliation people would say. So yeah, that's what I can say about that. And I'd love to hear whether you think that should be in the book, because part of me is also like, I don't know if I want to get into a fight with people who feel very strongly about these things, but some of that will be in the book.
Those who know me say definitely it's a good fight.
Yeah, right.
Hisham?
Thank you very much. Very enlightening presentation, which I really enjoyed. I have a question about thinking, also a question from outside of the box, if you will. I'm just thinking a little bit about the negative cases, and trying to kind of unpack the negative cases a little bit more. Maybe this is not something for your current book, but maybe like a follow-up project. I'm wondering if you thought about contexts in which clear, targeted violence with attribution that is cross-cutting, that is actually targeting multiple ethnic groups or multiple groups, and it's crossing cleavages. So does this type of cross-cutting violence produce any type of cross-cutting solidarity, the memory of collective violence in that case? How does that legacy pronounce itself later on? Or have you seen cases or read about cases in which this is perfect?
Yeah, no, that's interesting. So there is a bit of some literature on sort of victim groups, like how different victim groups interact with each other in different contexts. Not all of it entirely sort of violence related, but sometimes sort of discrimination related. But and I don't know that I've seen sort of a clear direction. So sometimes you get sort of evidence and theories about competitive victimhood, but I would guess has sort of political reasons behind it too. But post-conflict. So you might think of like I don't know if this is going to be controversial to say, but sort of post-Holocaust, sort of the way that different sort of groups who were victims of Nazi Germany compete for sort of the level of victimization that they suffered, and it doesn't seem to generate kind of solidarity among victim groups. It's actually seemed to generate the opposite. But then there is some literature on kind of solidarity producing the Soviet Union, for example. Leo, my co-author, actually has some work on ethnic Koreans who were deported also into Central Asia by Stalin. Again, there's a lot of this kind of movement of ethnic groups. And there's some interesting, like, ethnic Uzbek, ethnic Korean kind of intermarrying and sort of solidarity that emerges. The Crimean Tatars, again, are sort of separated because they're in this. But yeah, so I don't know if I could say that there's like that I've read kind of a clear direction there, but we haven't looked at, and we don't really have cases. I mean, these are all kind of sort of, directed at a particular group, but yeah, no, I think it'd be interesting to look at.
Thank you.
I'm going to insert myself into the queue and ask if there's what happens on the perpetrator side. So there's obviously a lot of people who commit the violence get to stay in power. And in the United States, for example, like the Acharya Sen and Blackwell book shows that white slave owners in the South, that there's intergenerational transmission of at the very least racism, if not violence. So, and sometimes violence. So I know this wasn't part of your investigation, but does it potentially also create some kind of solidarity among the perpetrators of violence, and that perpetuates not necessarily in the form of violence, but at least in repression and racism?
Yeah. I mean, yeah, I think so. I mean, you'd think, well, at least some of the work on sort of why people perpetrate violence would lead you to think that in order to get people to perpetrate violence, you have to sort of sell them on an ideology or a theory, right? The racism, the sort of white supremacy, and you would expect parents to then socialize their children that way, right? So yeah, I think there's sort of good reason to think that perpetrators would sort of move in that you would sort of perpetrating violence and being the victim of violence would both produce this kind of outcome. Studying perpetrators is really hard at the individual level. Yeah, even for, some of our surveys where, like in the Ishila context, but also in Cambodia, where we asked people whether members of their families were in the civil patrols, but that kind of stuff is really sensitive, much more sensitive than talking about sort of victimization. So I think it's really hard to study that at the level that we want to do it. But the like Acharya et al. Book is at the kind of aggregate level. So that's, I think, where you can, yeah.
Okay, Dinsha?
This was really interesting. I think that there might be, just in terms of context, I see how certain forms of violence can relate to identity, but I think there's also probably a political dimension to how these identities are shaped, right? So you've got people who are clearly going to want to make it clear responsibility world, ambiguous responsibility world. If you engage with Truth and Reconciliation Commission, I would say it doesn't even matter whether there's work or not in the ways that you would expect, but just looking at the politics, trying to get into that, trying to understand why somebody might want to make it a clearly attributable case versus a ambiguous responsibility case. It just feels like there's a piece that's missing somewhere in that space.
You're saying post-conflict or during conflict, the perpetrator has a...
Well, usually post-conflict, for shaping the identity, right? So if you're saying violence shapes identity, which then conditions attitudinal behaviors, there has to be something else. It's not just the violence itself, right? There must be somebody has to be saying, this is important to me for maybe group consolidation, or this is important to me for creating some sort of intergroup cohesion. Some political entrepreneur might be doing something behind the scenes, either trumpeting up what the violence is, or saying, no, that violence doesn't really matter, or trying to make it much more ambiguous versus more clear. Just seems like there might be a political dimension there.
Yeah. I wonder if this is, if you find this convincing. The way I guess I think about it usually is there's certainly people who are, there's certainly a political process that's post-conflict sort of tying group identity to victimization and things like that. So there's a Crimean Tatar nationalist movement, during the sort of period where they're in Central Asia and things like that. I guess what's not obvious to me is, so I would think of that as that would be true for everyone. So everybody's a victim here. There's nobody who's not a victim, right? And you're sort of injecting that into sort of group identity should be true for everyone who's a member of the group or in some, some sort of distributional way. But why would it be correlated with people who suffered more versus people who suffered less, except via its effect on their attachment to the group, right? So that's at least to me sort of seems like, so that certainly is happening, could be happening. But I want to kind of set it aside, and it seems reasonable to me to sort of set it aside because it seems like it would be something that would be kind of a uniform treatment, let's say. Do you find that convincing?
Talk a little more about it. I can see the exact same violent conflict if you have different kinds of political dimensions happening, right? Some different kind of outcome happening with the identity. But obviously, I mean, maybe for the cleanness of your story, you might not want to get lost in those details. I just think that there's been a lot that's written about it, a lot that's been studied about it. And to completely say that it is
Yeah.
you probably don't want to do that.
No, right. Yeah.
Brett.
Great. I really enjoyed the presentation. Thank you. So, all right. So so this notion of sort of violence being mostly exogenous at the individual level, right? I mean, that's making that argument is kind of clearly good for the empirical work that that you want to do. I guess I'm just curious. I mean, if there's something how I should think about legacies of violence within groups that were targeted with more discriminant violence, right? And so I guess so one way to think about it might be that it's sort of violence is targeted discriminately, then at the group level, you could just think of it as a fixed effect that would reduce the magnitude of the effects that you get by group, right? So in some sense, it would just be fewer because the violence is discriminant, and fewer individuals presumably would be affected by it than at this sort of indiscriminate violence at the group level, right? And so then discriminant violence, one would think of this again as just having sort of fixed effect and kind of magnitude of the effects over the long term. And so then maybe that's another argument in favor of discriminant violence rather than indiscriminate violence, right? But I guess I'm just curious, I mean, if there's some other, if how you think about it, and to what extent you think the empirical results might be different in a context where violence sort of was targeted more discriminately at the individual level. It's the fixed effect thing would just be if it's only just a fixed effect in some sense, that's good for your argument, right?
Yeah.
Because then there would be no bias or whatever. But I'm just kind of curious, how to think about it.
I try to avoid this language of selective versus indiscriminate because I think we get really misled by some of the stuff on indiscriminate violence. So like in the Crimean Tatar case, right? We're arguing that there's the sort of who loses more family members is sort of indiscriminate. But it's not experienced by anyone as indiscriminate, right? I mean, it's experienced as this is happening to me because I am Crimean Tatar and I've been deported and put in this concentration camp and etc. So that's my sort of why I try not to wade into selective versus indiscriminate, but it is, I think your point is still right, that for kind of methodological reasons, we focus on sort of things that are plausibly exogenous, and there's a whole host of targeting that is, more specific, politically motivated, specific to people who have sort of more political identity and things like that. I don't know that a priori I would expect different things. I think I would expect very similar things. If the conditions hold, if sort of you have clear attribution of responsibility and you feel like you're being targeted because you're a member of an ethnic group, but they targeted your family because they were sort of communal leaders or slightly wealthier or they wore glasses, or something in the sort of Cambodian. But those would be harder to observe because they would be sort of confounded. So yeah, theoretically, I don't think there's reasons to think that it would be different, but you're right that there's kind of a scope condition here that we don't look at those, yeah.
Alberta?
So, this is fascinating work, and I'm amazed at the kind of field work that you show and the kind of care with making sure enumerators are local, all these kinds of things that you didn't talk so much about. I have a couple of questions which are a bit follow-ups on things people have already pressed you a little bit on, but on Disha's point, it seems to me that there is something odd about the way you're thinking about ethnicity and ethnicity construction, because if you think about the coefficient of the first, the one of deaths in exiled Guatemala, I would have expected that one to be significant and positive, while everything else would not, according to the argument. In some ways, I would expect some kind of affirmation of identity produced by the victimhood. And I suspect what's happening is maybe some kind of cross effects, that like in Guatemala and El Salvador in the 1930s, everybody abandoned the indigenous identity because it was so dangerous to be indigenous, period. In 20 years, in 15 years, they abandoned every trace of indigeneity. Well, of course, others might do the opposite strategy. I think there's something out there, and maybe part of it is because, and I'm just articulating kind of a hypothesis, maybe it's because it is the intensity of victimhood that is really the independent variable. That it is I can understand why you did it that way, but if you just had victimhood versus no victimhood, I would think that the identity would become so highly mobilized. So I wanted to understand that a little bit better. The second one is about gender. So because of how important the Hill case is in terms of the kind of legal precedent of Guatemala. So I don't know how aware people are of this, but this is an incredibly important case. There's a documentary, Pamela Yates, called 500 Years, where she shows the whole process, and Irma Alicia Velázquez de Matush, who was our finger visiting professor during the pandemic. No one of you saw her. She was with us for 2 years, but she's really very prominent in that case and in the documentary as well. But that case is about sexual violence. So that's kind of a different dimension of this, because it is not about torture, it's not exactly about death, but it is about women. The Guatemalans created a crimes against women kind of old prosecution, has been Barrios. I was trying to check her name. She's been here also invited to some of our events. But the thing is, did you find gender effects in some of the things you're looking at? Did you find any trace of because that's different from the Truth and Reconciliation. It is really done in the justice system. Yeah. And the guy was indicted and prosecuted and everything, Rios Montt. So yeah. I don't know.
Yeah. Although nobody seemed to know. When we did the survey, the case was, he was still alive and the case was ongoing, and people were just, we seemed to be aware, or very few. One of the things that we sort of say up front is that sexual violence may be completely different. There's lots of reasons to think that there's evidence to suggest that from psychology of trauma that the psychological effects of sexual violence are very different from the psychological effects of other kinds of violence. We tried lots of different things in the field in Guatemala because sexual violence, we know, it was very prevalent and sort of widely used by the army, very strategically. We tried various different ways of asking questions about that, and it's very, very difficult. Yeah. To the point, where like our enumerators were unwilling to ask some things, not even just the respondents. So, I can't say really anything, and I think we say up front that there's sort of theoretical reasons to think it would be different, and we can't measure it. We didn't measure it. I think it's okay because I don't think it's correlated with the other kinds of violence and things like that. So, but to your point, we haven't sort of looked at, just splitting by gender and seeing sort of what that looks like. So, that is something we can do. The other thing that we haven't done yet, but that we are planning on doing, which goes to your sort of first question, is so unlike the El Salvador case, I think in this case, sort of abandoning indigenous identity would have been very difficult, but because of the much more local context. But what people did do is abandon the religion. So Rios Montt is sort of famously evangelical, and a lot of the army officers are evangelical, and it was widely believed by people that if they converted, became evangelical, then they would be less likely to be targeted, and this could be a way of sort of, protecting your family or yourself. And so we did gather information from people who said that they were evangelical when they converted, and some questions about that. We had looked at that. But so you could imagine sort of a cross, like a canceling out if, and it is a sizable, as you know, but like 50% of Guatemala now is evangelical. So it's a sizable part of this community is now evangelical, and most of that converting happened in the 80s. So we have that. We have looked at it.
Sorry,
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, this is interesting coincidence because we have Ukrainians out there.
Wow.
Great.
I don't think that's ever happened to me before.
Yeah, I just would like to add that we should maybe add the history of relationship between Ukrainians and Russia, because first Russian occupation happened in 1783, so we help us to understand the nature of these relations. And actually, as you mentioned, the Ukrainian Tatars supported Chechens during the Chechen War. It's because they actually Ukrainian Tatars and Chechens had the same enemy, and that's why not only because Ukrainian citizenship, but also because this enemy of Russia, Ukrainian Tatars are fighting with Ukrainians against aggressors. But based on your research, how do you think this situation and relation between Ukrainian Tatars and Russia will develop, given history, demographic factor, persecutions, and actually Russian propaganda? How it will end?
I guess what I have to say is that what I'm looking at is variation among Crimean Tatars, and a lot of that individual, sort of family level variation sort of dissipates over time, as you would sort of expect, because people whose grandparents were victimized more married people whose grandparents were victimized less, and so like the kinds of things that the sort of correlations get, they're not one from generation to generation. Your question is a little bit more general about, like Crimean Tatars in general, and their attitudes towards Russians, which you know, I don't think I can say much about based on sort of the data that we have. What I can say, just sort of, you know, anecdotally, when we did the survey and the field work that we did in 2014 was, we were there in October 2014, so this was, you know, 8 months after the invasion. And people told us that, and you know, you already know this, people told us, Crimean Tatars told us that when Russia invaded, they packed their bags in case, you know, they were deported again, somehow, you know, sort of moved somewhere else. So, you know, the fear, I think, is quite prominent. You know, we see more fear among people whose grandparents, right, were sort of exposed to more violence, but I think there's, you know, sort of a level of fear that's, you know, pretty pervasive. I can't imagine that anything that Russia has done since taking over Crimea has reassured people, Crimean Tatars, right? So, and there's lots of ways in which they've sort of repressed Crimean Tatar political organizations and leaders and TV stations and things like that. The radio station, actually a lot of our enumerators worked at the Crimean Tatar radio station. That's kind of where we got them from. So yeah, I mean, there's sort of continued repression. So, you know, yeah, I can't imagine reconciliation.
So I have more like a methodological question that kind of tries to like get at this like I'm really interested in this like this out-group in-group kind of dynamic and also kind of like their lack of knowledge. For example, Rios monks. Do you think like maybe using implicit association tests in this context might help get at that? Because like I know in for example the DRC, when people are showing the picture of Mobutu, like they have a very visceral reaction. So like, do you think if you know you're showing a picture of like a Guatemalan army soldier, or for example, Monk himself, do you think that you would get that similar thing, or is it more of a disconnect between the individuals in that imagery, or is it more just kind of like the experience?
So you know what's interesting, and it goes back to this point about, you know, what it looks like from the outside versus how people experience it. So people who study Guatemalan politics have been puzzled by the fact that when Rios Montt ran for president in the late 1990s, he got a lot of votes in the Ixil region. And this is sort of presented as a puzzle because here is a guy who was in charge of genocide in this region, and yet his victims vote for him. Right? I think it's actually not a puzzle because they don't think of themselves as his victims. And you know, you have to sort of understand the context in which the violence took place and the violence was experienced, right? A lot of it was Ixil, right? These civil patrols and then, you know, there is some post-conflict stuff that the army does, and you know, we do sort of have to talk about this in the Guatemalan case. The army sort of comes in and builds roads and builds villages and does a lot of sort of rebuilding and kind of economic development in the region, and then which today leads to sort of extraction and all sorts of you know, mining and things like that in the region. But yeah, so my guess is it wouldn't have those effects, and it's for exactly the reasons that, you know, but yeah, but I mean, I'm sort of speculating.
Are there any final questions? No, thank you so much, Noam, for being here.
Thank you, that's great.